My friends, the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word took flesh and pitched his tent with us. That's the way John begins what we call the fourth gospel. He knows that there are already three. They're pretty linear, similar to one another. That's why they're called synoptic, having the same vision. And he and the team of creative people who recrafted much of the stories and so on, they put it in the form of Greek theater in John's gospel. But they borrow the very opening words of the play from the very opening words of God's book, all the way back to page 1, book 1, the very beginning of what we consider sacred scripture. And there we find this idea in one of the two creation stories that God is outside of everything before there is anything to be in other than himself, but is out and between wherever God is and what this is going to become. There's a great abyss. And God speaks across the great abyss and says, "Let there be light." And there's light. But the word has to get from the mouth of God to the other side of an abyss. And for John, that would be Jesus, who's going to be called Jesus the Christ. He was with God in the beginning, part of everything that ever happened. It goes way beyond baby Jesus stories that we do at Christmas time, that are in Luke and in Matthew. John takes us all the way back to the beginning of everything except God, who has no beginning. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word took flesh and dwelt here with us, built a tent with us. What he's dealing with is this ancient problem that's all the way up to right now. The problem with the imagination about where is God and where are we. If you have studied anything about world religion or cultural anthropology, all the way back to all these people that lived on continents that the other ones didn't even know existed. All over the planet, people were trying to somehow commune, to be one with the divine, one with God. And even though they didn't get together to confer about it, they all ended up doing pretty much the same thing. That is, building some sort of worship center on the hardest possible place to get to. We're in Tucson. Not everybody, because we're live streamed on the internet, which goes all over the place. Tucson's not that hard to get around on a Sunday morning, is it? You didn't have to climb a mountain to get here. But all over the world, people built these really inaccessible worship spots, not to make it hard on people to worship or gather, but because they just figured God seems so far away that we ought to go to a mountaintop at least and try to connect with God. Have you ever felt like you're praying as hard as you know how, but you're not connecting somehow, or God's not hearing you? Have you ever shouted at a starry sky or a sunset, or felt like you needed to go to a mountaintop or something? There's that gap. In Genesis, it's called an abyss. But the good news is at the very beginning of John, he was with God, and he was God, and he took flesh, and he came here to be with us. He pitched his tent with us. Well, on the Feast of the Body of Christ, sometimes some of the prayers in the liturgy focus very much on the body of Christ, the consecrated bread that we will eat. And that story was prominent in the gospel today. That story where he got them together on the Passover, and then he transformed a meal that they were already used to celebrating once a year and said, except there's more to it than you know. This is my body. This is my blood. Here, take it in you. receive me into you. I don't want to just be in a tent next to your tent. I don't want to be inside you. Well, it goes like that. I just finished teaching the whole of John's Gospel on a Zoom retreat that you can find on my website, or if you wanted to, it's on my YouTube channel. He's the only one that has the Cana wedding story. You just get this poem at the front end about the cosmos. He was with God and was God and all that. And then you plop down into a wedding. The curtain opens on a wedding, and there's all this wedding noise and joy and stuff, except then it sort of gets muted because they're running out of wine. If you were playing Pictionary and you were trying to get me to say the wedding at Cana, what would you draw? Those jars. They're 6 stone water jars, and they're huge. If you had it on a stage, you'd have to kind of put them right at the front with lights on them to make the audience know, there's these jars here. Well, then the problem becomes they've run out of wine. Remember, the mother of Jesus thinks this is his problem. He says, what's this with me? It's not my time. Just do what he says. We were told that the reason that they're there is because they're for Jewish ceremonial religious washings. The presumption is you're too dirty to come into this wedding the way you showed up. It's cosmic dirtiness. It's an idea that God is all pure and we're all not pure. And so before we even try to commune with God, we got to get ourselves cleaned up. And there was these big jars there for that purpose, but you know the way the story goes. The dang things are empty. And this wedding guest, Jesus, who we've been told already was with God in the beginning and is God, shows up to the wedding. When he's challenged and all but forced to do something about the lack of wine, he looks at these jars there that are used to wash people because they're so dirty. It reminds me of some tubs that we use in Catholic Church only once a year. Manny, do you know where they are? You work here. You probably know every last closet in this place. Do you know where they are? They're only used once a year, so you don't keep them handy. They're on a top shelf or something. And they're for people to put their feet in that ceremony that we do on Holy Thursday, the washing of the feet. In fact, look at you, live stream people. On the back of this vestment, can you see it? It's Jesus washing feet. That's why I'm wearing it today. He looks at these tubs that are used for washing yourself, and they're empty, and they need wine. So he says, fill those up with water. We're going to drink out of them. And then, of course, when we do, it's the best wine, and it's over the top, it's crazy, beautiful, wonderful joy. It starts like that. It keeps going, but Jesus does all these different things in John's gospel. I'm going to preach long, but I really have to go short, at least try to. He does all these things, and in all 4 gospel traditions, there starts to be rumors about him. You know, if you know Jesus Christ Superstar, you know the song? What's the buzz? Tell me what's happening. What's the buzz? Tell me what. He knows he's being talked about, and it's about who he is. Because there seems to be something about him that's more than meets the eye. And so people are talking about him, and he asks us, what are people saying about me? Well, some of them think that you're like reincarnated, that you're Elijah or one of the prophets come back from the dead. Maybe you're John the Baptist who hasn't even been dead all that long. You're something. And Peter's the one that comes out with it just because he just is probably an extrovert and probably not too afraid of looking stupid. And he just blurts out, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he gets it right, the way you might have in a math classroom in elementary school. And then you're asked to come to the front and show your work. This happened to me. I got the answer right, and the teacher thought I was brilliant, and I needed to come to the front and show everybody how I got the answer right. And of course, I didn't have a clue. And neither did Peter that day, but he got the answer right. And then Jesus starts unburdening himself. Oh, and thank God, I've been waiting for somebody to understand who I am. And because you understand that I'm the Christ, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. They're going to arrest me. They're going to kill me. And 3 days later. And you remember what Peter said next? Help me out. Yes, you do. What did he say next? Don't go to Jerusalem. Don't do it. Don't do what you've been sent here to do. Don't do it. Whereupon Jesus has to look Peter in the eye and say, class, get behind me, Satan. Have you ever said that to anybody in your life? Even if you have a foul mouth? Can you think of a harsher thing to say to anybody on earth? Get behind me, Satan. You're not talking God's words anymore. But Peter said, you're the Christ. The word in Hebrew was Messiah, and it had 3 different ideas attached to it. It's an old idea, way before Jesus. And it had to do with power, leadership, and the presence of God, who seems so far away, but somehow mysteriously seems to be with us, kind of. You remember, like in the desert, shows up in a burning bush, and then he goes with them sort of through the desert, and there's some sort of cloud and a tent where they meet up with him in a tabernacle. There's all this stuff about he seems so far away, but then there are other times when we get glimpses where he feels like he's right here. Hasn't that happened in your life? God, who's all everything and enormous and mysterious and stuff, haven't there been moments in your life where you just feel like you can touch him or he can touch you? It's like that. Well, anyway, they thought that there were 3 different things tied up in the idea of the Messiah. One of them was it would be a king, powerful king with the pedigree to prove it, the bloodline, the gown, the crown. They had had kings through parts of their history, but they were not a very strong group of people militarily. They kept getting overrun by other people, and then the king would disappear and resurface some other time. Anyway, but there's this idea that God could be with us through the authority given to a leader like a king. That was one thing. Another was priests. If we didn't have kings right now, well, priests could kind of fill in the gap. They could be God's agents on earth. In fact, yesterday in San Francisco, 3 of our Dominicans were ordained to the priesthood yesterday, and 3 more to the diaconate, which means they'll be priests a year from now. Tomorrow, it'll be my 36th anniversary of my priesthood, and on Friday, it'll be, I think, is it John Paul's 27th, 28th? Both Father John Paul and I have our anniversaries this week. The idea of priesthood has with it this idea of trying to bridge that gap, that abyss, when it does seem like God is up here and we're down here, not just in the Catholic Church, but in priesthood broadly understood across time and space. Priests or priestesses are people that sort of bridge the gap somehow. One of the bishops that I once served said, he reminded me that the word pontiff that we use to describe the Pope, the pontiff, is from pontoon, which is a temporary bridge. And this bishop said, Nathan, if you're going to be a bridge, be prepared to be stepped on from the right and the left. And I believe that's true. If you want to bridge gaps, it's not always going to please people. But anyway, priests and kings, they both get ceremonies. And in the ancient world, at least in the Hebrew world, they didn't put a crown on your head to show that you were a king or a queen. They used chrism, ointment. That's where the word Christ comes from. It's chrismed person, oiled, greased person. Well, in the story, the kings and the priests get ceremonies where they're chrismed. The prophets don't. There were some prophets who were professional prophets that were paid by the kings, and they were kind of like what we're used to seeing of the politician's spokesperson who tells us the truth as told them by their boss. And sometimes it might be true, and other times it's just nonsense, it's just spin. Well, we didn't invent that. That goes all the way back into the ancient times. And there were prophets who were paid by the king who told you what God wants you to do. Sometimes these other prophets came out of nowhere, like John the Baptist, and they just spoke the truth with power, and it gave them authority that didn't get conferred through a ceremony. They just spoke authoritatively because the truth can do that. Have you experienced that in your life? Has anybody ever spoken the truth to you even though they were younger than you? Or maybe less important than you? Had less money than you? Or something? Have you ever heard the truth from some unlikely source, but you couldn't deny it because it was just true? Prophets work that way. They don't always have the credentials, they just have the truth that God has given them to speak, and they do it even if it means they get killed, like John the Baptist, beheaded. So how would you feel when you're Jesus and you say, what are they saying about me? And they say, good news, they think you're a prophet. If you'd like to kind of keep your head connected to your shoulders, maybe that's just not what you wanted to hear. But anyway, Jesus has got all this going on, this messiahship. They're saying he's the Messiah, which they're used to thinking of means at the top of the pyramid, the boss. And Jesus says, I am that. And remember, it means Christ. It just translates from Hebrew over into Greek. Yes, I am the Christ, but here's what it's going to mean. We're going to go to Jerusalem. They're going to arrest me, convict me, kill me. And 3 days later, I'll rise. Are you on board with that? Want to come along? He even told us 3 times, you sure you want to follow? Because that's where we're going. Well, he's in the middle of his preaching one day, and you know this story. He's interrupted with somebody that says, the one that you have a special love for is dying. Stop what you're doing and come quick. Remember that? Lazarus, your friend, he's dying. Stop what you're doing, come quickly. Well, he doesn't, because he's doing what he came to do. I'll get to that. This is not going to end in death. I'm doing what I need to do right now. But then he does get there, and he learns that his friend has died, remember? And the sisters, Martha and Mary, are crying and all of that. And he says, take me to him. Where did they put him? Where is his body? He goes there, and he's acting like he's actually going to call his friend back from the dead, remember? And do you remember what he's told right on the edge of it? I know you do. Oh, don't do that because you're not helping today. It's going to stink. He's been dead for 4 days. There's going to be a stench. It's going to go all over the place. And he's looking over at Lazarus' sister. Remember, he's life enfleshed. I am the way, the truth, and the life. He's life enfleshed. But there's death over here, and you have to focus on one or the other, and they focused on the death. And he starts crying. And he also knows that if he calls Lazarus out of the tomb, it's not going to stay empty. That tomb needs a body in it, and it's going to be his. If he calls Lazarus out, they're going to have to swap places. Wouldn't that make you cry? But what does he do? He shouts, Lazarus, come out! Yeah, get up, buddy. And it's going to have your name in that sentence when your time comes. Your name here. Come out. And, of course, he does. In the very next scene, Mary, the sister of the formerly dead Lazarus, now raised, they're having a meal. And remember that the men and the women didn't eat in the same room. The meal was for the men. The women cooked it, cleaned up after it, ate somewhere else. But in this meal, this woman, the sister of Lazarus, Mary, shows up. And what does she bring with her? Chrism, ointment. Because Jesus has been baptized, but he hasn't been chrismated. He hasn't been anointed yet. Do you remember your baptism? Or has anybody told you about it? I was 3 weeks old in April of 1956. But I know what they did. They poured water, and then the priest reached for the chrism, because that comes on next. While the baby said, or the adult said, is still wet, the chrism goes on it. You were chrismed. That's why you're a Christian. You were chrismed. Well, Jesus hadn't been christened, and there was no king around to do it, no high priest around to do it. Who ends to be the sacramental minister? It's this woman, Mary, brother of Lazarus, friend of Jesus, who, even though she was his friend, she still had to come to a dawning knowledge of who he really is. And when she did, she took ointment that was worth 300 days' wages. I was doing the math of it. If you don't work on Sunday, how many Sundays are there in the year? There's 52, aren't there? And then 300 into 365 minus 52, 300. It was practically an entire year's wage. And she buys chrism, and then she doesn't pour it over his head, she pours it over his feet. And then she wipes his feet with her hair. It's so lavish and so tender and so unexpected. And there's a lovely detail in John that says, and the aroma of it filled the whole room. It's the exact opposite of, there's going to be a stench. The aroma of it filled the whole room. Switch to the next chapter, and we get to where we are today. I'm deeply into this homily time, and we're only getting to the point. Today is the Passover meal, except in John's gospel, when the scene opens, everybody's just about finished eating. They're clearing away the plates. And instead of those words of institution that were in Mark's gospel today, take this and eat it, take this and drink it, John had already told that story back in chapter 6 when there was a hungry crowd. And he said, how are we going to feed all these people? His disciples get it wrong, make a sarcastic remark about it. Andrew at least says, well, there is a kid here with 5 loaves and 2 fish. What good would that be for so many? Get him to sit down. And then he didn't just say, get out of my way, I got this. He blessed the food, and then he said, you, here, go feed each other. And then after that, when they all couldn't eat anymore, remember what the last line of that story is? You do. Go collect up all the fragments. You know why that's so important? Because we're the fragments. Haven't you ever felt like a fragment? That you're only this just bit of stuff, just a leftover? That's the Lord wanting to collect you up. You can't be left out. You're too important. Gather up all the fragments. We need to collect everything together. Well then, while they're clearing away the food, Jesus, it says, takes off the outer garment, gets down on his hands and knees, and starts washing feet. Because it's the descent that's been going on from the very beginning, across the abyss, down out of the sky, down here where you are, dwelling with us in a tent, now coming to live inside of us. But not only that, wants to be down on his hands and knees, taking care of you. That's what it is to be the Christ. That's the name that you and I have. Does it fit? Can you see yourself down on your hands and knees, lifting up someone else's dignity, somebody that hardly ever gets treated like they're important or worth anything? Down on your hands and knees, serving, giving up the titles or the position or whatever, because who needs it? When you know that you're absolutely loved by the Creator of the whole universe, who's going to take that away from you? You can lose everything else, and that can't be taken away. It's our joy. It's our identity. You and I, on the feast of the body and blood of Christ, we not only celebrate the presence of Christ in the Eucharist that we can take in us, that becomes a part of our own bloodstream in every cell, every tissue. But then he says, would you get to work with me? Would you do what I do? Would you get down on your hands and knees and show everybody you can find how important they are? Because I want to raise them up to the full dignity. They were never dirty to begin with. Give them a glass of wine. Have a party. Celebrate that I am who you thought was on a mountaintop is right here with you, now and forever. Happy feast day.